There's the pass to Leitner. Puts it up. Yes!
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Camera Chronicles. I'm your host, Max Rego. Hope everyone is having a happy holidays and is ready for 2022. We've actually got a special episode for you today. So back in the fall, I thought it would be a great idea to reach out to a bunch of former Chronicle sports editors and sports managing editors and just sit down with them. So many podcasts have done this sort of end-of-year project, including the Low Laying Up podcast, which I've been a huge fan of over the years. With it obviously being Coach K's final season, I wanted to talk with each guy about their respective times covering the program. Each of them had some awesome stories to share, including some funny interactions with Coach K. He was obviously the focus of a lot of our conversations, and generally just the humps and bumps of some really talented teams, including the 2015 championship team, actually. So shout out to everyone for taking the time to chat, and thanks to Jake Piazza for greenlighting this little medley project a few months back. Hope you guys enjoy really an hour plus of some cool stories. So without further ado, let's get things started. We're going in chronological order today, actually, so you can switch around to a bunch of different eras, which will be great. Let's start with Jon Scher, who was the sports editor during the 1982-83 season. He talks about the early days of Coach K.
I was the guy who covered the bad teams. I got to Duke at the same time Coach K did in the fall of 1980. Spent my first year at the Chronicle covering soccer and wrestling. The soccer team was really good. And K had leftovers from the team that went to the Final Four in 78, Gene Banks, Kenny Denard, Jim Sudduth. And so they won enough games. I think they won 18 games that first year and got to the NIT and had some memorable wins. And then Denard and Banks graduated. And by the middle of my sophomore year, the veteran sports editors resigned. And I was left to cover this team that was really, really bad. It was K. K was young, and I was pretty green. It was a learning experience for me in a lot of ways, and a great experience to be in the ground floor. As things have turned out, obviously to see how they were, trying to build the program and changing gears, when the approach they were taking to recruiting initially didn't work. But a lot of my memories are personal, right? It's like personal to me because it's all about me. The first time I sat down with Kay to do a feature interview, I was doing a feature on a graduating senior named Larry Linney, who was a reserve. And Larry wasn't happy with his playing time. And so when I sat down to talk to Coach K, my first question, knowing really nothing about what I was doing, was Larry says he's unhappy with his playing time. And you can see where this is going. K, basically, to his credit, he got red in the face, but he kept his cool. And he said to me very calmly, is this going to be a story about Larry's frustration or a story about Larry? And what I learned from that as a journalist was the very simple lesson of don't ask the hard question first. And it seems obvious, but I didn't know that at the time. And again, to Kay's credit, I was nervous, as I recall, but he gave me the time I needed. The story turned out fine. And the other thing that I remember about covering those teams was, and this is the team, the 81-82 team and the 82-83 team, which were very different. The 81-82 team had, Chip Engelland, Tom Emma, Mike Tissot, guys, a few leftovers from the Bill Foster era, and really not much else. The players on that team were second and third choices in recruiting because the big names that K went after in his second year all turned Duke down. Duke was, a finalist in the running for I think it was Uwe Blab who went to Indiana. Bill Wennington went to St. John's. Jim Miller went to Virginia. Duke was in the running for all those guys. And Duke wound up with, guys you've never heard of. So they were they were struggling. I think the fact that I think K won 4 games in the conference that year with that team, playing against Michael Jordan in Carolina and a really good NC State team coached by Valvano. It's kind of amazing in retrospect that they were able to win 4 games, but they were not really competitive and not good. And it was frustrating. And then you could see it. I went on one road trip. I think that first year I was sports editor to Colorado and California, and Duke lost both games. And I remember getting invited to the post-game dinner in San Francisco, and it was the SIDs and me and Kay and his wife, and it was all off the record. But Kay was talking about the frustration and the exhaustion of being on the recruiting trail that year. And I remember him saying when he was in West Virginia, to watch Jim Miller play, and there could be no contact, as I recall. And the story was that Miller was going to let them know by leaving, or his father was going to let them know by leaving a note in the mailbox as to whether or not he was still interested. And Kay had spent this whole day, driving to West Virginia, watching Jim Miller play. And then I think the story was that after the game, he rode by and checked the mailbox, and there was a note saying, thanks very much, but Jim's not interested. And Kay at that point realized he hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast, and the only thing open was a grocery store. And he was talking about going to this random grocery store in West Virginia and wandering up and down the aisles looking for something to eat. And that really struck me, it was too bad it was off the record. It's been so long. I don't think anyone would mind me telling that story. And it gives you an indication of what life was like on the recruiting trail, how lonely and frustrating and tiring, it was. So they brought in some new staff and recalibrated the recruiting approach. As was talked about in great detail in the ESPN documentary, The Class That Saved Coach K, they were able to, I wrote the story when Johnny Dawkins, who was one of the top recruits in the country, if not the top recruit, signed to come to Duke. He turned the program around. The whole class, Billis, Allery, Henderson, it's all been really well chronicled. We saw flashes of the talent, but we didn't see results in that first year. Could we see what was coming? Absolutely. I wrote it in the Chronicle that, that I thought they were going to be able to make it work, that from what I was seeing, they were putting a foundation in place that had a chance to succeed. Did I predict that they were going to win 5 national championships and that we would be talking about this 40 years later? No. I'm not surprised that the program was able to, be successful. They were able to turn it around. And in my memory, the Iron Dukes were frustrated, but there was I don't remember pitchforks and flaming brooms, but I wasn't on the inside of that.
Right. This isn't really a Duke related question, but obviously has to do with those early 80s. But what was it like seeing Coach K, you mentioned playing in North Carolina? What was it like covering those early battles with Dean Smith, and especially obviously, we have to mention Michael Jordan. He has to come up in any basketball podcast. So what was it like just covering those few games?
Yeah, I mean, it was a privilege in retrospect to have been able to go to games at Carmichael Auditorium, which smelled like, and still does, by the way, smells like chlorine because it's attached to the pool at Carolina. I mean, I was at the game when the lights went out, and that was the game that Duke was competitive, and they were competitive in some of those games with teams that they really shouldn't have been on the court with. But yeah, I mean, the famous line about Dean Smith was, he was the greatest defensive coach of all time because he was the only one who was able to hold Michael Jordan under 20 points a game. And that was true. And I do remember, I mean, there are people who could tell many more and better Dean Smith stories than me. If you're talking to John Feinstein, for example, he's got that covered. But just having the memory of being in the post-game coaches scrum was not in a press. They had no press conference room at Carolina. I remember Dean doing the post-game presser in a stairwell, and sneaking a cigarette on the side. It was a great, and being able to watch Falvano and his program at NC State from a distance. We were part of the Anybody But Carolina school, so we were, Duke was full of NC State fans the year that State went to and won the championship in '83. But yeah, the difference between the programs was stark. I thought Duke would be able to have some success. Did I think that K would wind up, winning more games than Dean and basically taking Dean's place, as the guy that everybody was aiming for? I did not.
Next, we have John's brother, Charley. Charley was a sports editor during the 1985-86 season, the year that Duke reached its first Final Four under Coach K. Charley talked about that season and a whole lot of Johnny Dawkins.
I started as a freshman in '83-84, and that was the first year that Coach K took a team to the NCAA tournament. And they really, that was an exciting year. And then '84-85, there was a sense that they had underachieved. And all of a sudden we're to '85-86. And it is this senior-laden team with this phenomenal recruiting class, this first big recruiting class that had Johnny Dawkins and Mark Allery and Jay Billis and David Henderson. Those were the four principals. And Dawkins, I wish that, folks like you, Max, I don't know if you've ever gotten a chance to see any of his highlights, but he was the most electrifying player and had his pro career cut short really with an ACL tear. And he was sort of the classic guy who was not really he was point guard height, but he was more of a scoring guard. So he wasn't going to be a great NBA player, but he was an amazing college player. And the ACC in '85-86 was loaded. This was the era when, Jordan had left 2 years earlier after staying 3 years. Ralph Sampson left in '83, having played all 4 years, and he could have left any year to be a number one pick. So all of these teams were veterans. The coaches in the league in '85-86 were, you had Valvano and Dean Smith and Coach K all within a 30-minute radius, and guys like Bobby Cremins and Terry Holland, and Lefty was at Maryland. So it was an 8-team league, and it was loaded. So we kind of felt on campus like either Duke was going to get it done in '85-86, or we were about to fall off the cliff as a program, and who knew what the future would be like. And we went from that point to go 37-3, which for 20-something years was the all-time NCAA record for wins in a season, 37-2, until they lost the final game to Louisville. I'm sure I'd have to go look it up, but I'm sure Duke was a favorite in that game. And Carolina and Georgia Tech were both top 5 teams that year to sort of set the stage for what we had going on.
What was it like? I know you talked a little bit about him, but what was it like covering Dawkins? I've noticed in talking to a lot of former editors and covering these star players, Zion comes up a lot, and just how incredible it was to cover him. What was it like covering Dawkins kind of at the peak of his career?
Well, he was the most modest and unassuming guy. And I heard from people who were around the team that said he legitimately didn't read any newspaper articles about himself. Kind of a funny story. I remember one time being at one of the dining halls, and Dawkins came walking past me, and we weren't social friends or anything. He really didn't socialize that much on campus with anybody, other than once in a while you'd see him with some of the other basketball guys. But he just walked by me and just kind of smiled and said hello. and I walked past him, didn't really think anything of it. And I don't know if it was a freshman or a sophomore girl, some girl who I didn't know, looked up at me and wide-eyed and said, "You know Johnny Dawkins?" And it sort of, for me, that was part of what made the Chronicle experience so interesting and fun, is that you did get to know the people on the various teams, the players. We had a lot more access than you all enjoy. And again, while we weren't social friends, they weren't looking to hang around with sports writers, but they were almost universally respectful and fun to deal with. Jay Billis was a senior on the 86-87 team, and you could tell he was going to have some sort of a career that would involve, whether he was going to be a trial attorney or what he is now, a media mogul of sorts. Not surprised at all. He always spoke in fully formed paragraphs and detailed thought.
Right. That's interesting. One thing I wanted to kind of ask about as well is, how did the relationship between Coach K and Dawkins kind of play itself out? I know so many players have said, like, Coach K's had really good relationships with almost all of his players and all of his star players, but that relationship with Johnny is different. Did you kind of get that sense?
Probably not at the time. I think you're absolutely right in how things have evolved, but I don't think Johnny was ever a guy that needed a whole lot of coaching. And I would actually recommend to all of you, even though I'm not the world's biggest Jay Billis fan, if you've ever read the book Toughness by Jay Billis, I would recommend that. I know a lot of high school and college programs have their athletes read it, and he tells a lot of stories about the guys on that team. And Dawkins and Allery and David Henderson were just amazingly tough guys. And Billis, for all of his kind of guffawing like he wasn't a good player or wasn't all that tough, he was a tough guy too. He bulked up and played center at 6'8", and he was one of the early guys to really get muscled. And he was really a small forward who sacrificed to turn himself into a low post player, because that's what the team needed. I don't know that I really answered your question about Dawkins, but I think Dawkins was just a guy Krzyzewski didn't have to worry about a whole lot. If you ever have a minute, go look at the numbers. He played maybe 37, 38 minutes a game back then. Incredibly durable and fastest guy from end to end. Either he or Hurley were probably the fastest guys I ever saw, and just competed like crazy every game.
So a little bit of a gap here, actually. Next up is Ben Cohen, sports editor during the 2008-2009 season. He talks about the evolution of Coach K and the process during those years that culminated in the famous Duke Butler showdown in 2010.
It has become sort of clear to me in retrospect that I was covering Coach K at a time that turned out to be like a period of reinvention for him. And it was really hard to figure that out at the time. And there was actually sort of no way to know that. But, I moved onto East Campus in the fall of 2006. And one of the first things that happened when I got to Duke was that K lost the World Championships with Team USA. It turned out to be the only game that he lost while he was the coach of the American national team. And that sort of set the tone for like what the next 3-4 years were going to be like, because it was really a fallow period for Duke basketball. I mean, my freshman year, they lost in the first round of the tournament for the first time in forever. My sophomore year, they lost in the second round. My junior year, they lost in the Sweet 16. And my senior year, there was really nothing to suggest that that team was going to win a national championship when the season started. In fact, very early in the season, they played a game in Madison Square Garden, and famously during halftime, one of the ESPN analysts called the Duke basketball team alarmingly unathletic, which are two words that once you hear, you kind of never forget. And so, Duke at that time was coming off of 3 lousy tournament runs in a row. This is right after JJ Redick graduated. They hadn't recruited particularly well. Kentucky that year was sort of back with John Calipari. North Carolina had won the national championship the year before, and had become this juggernaut. Under Roy Williams, and Duke was kind of left out. And there were stories written all the time, like, is this the end of Coach K? What it turned out to be was like sort of this improbable late career rebirth. I mean, they won the national championship in 2010, obviously, with the type of team that he would never have today, and I think was kind of the last kind of team that has won a national championship for him. I mean, it started 3 seniors and 2 juniors, and it was a really great college basketball team that happened to be hiding in plain sight all year long. This was also, in addition to being in a strange point of K's career, it was right before analytics really took over college basketball, and smart college basketball fans were on KenPom.com all day long. It was in that time when nobody really trusted numbers, and no one, if you were a smart basketball fan, maybe you knew what offensive and defensive efficiency was, but it was kind of more common and almost even cooler to not know what it was, or pretend to know what it was, or care what it was. And so it was kind of the last year. And the reason I bring any of this up is because Duke, for a very long time that season, was ranked number 1 in KenPom's ratings. It was clearly statistically the best team in the country. And yet nobody really treated them that way. They were a number 1 seed, but people looked at, Jon Scher and Nolan Smith and Kyle Singler, and it didn't look like a national championship team, especially having been biased by what happened the last 3 years. And so that team was a number 1 seed that was loaded with what turned out to be some future NBA talent, and, was sitting atop the statistical rankings all year long. And they kind of won an unlikely national championship, which seems sort of strange to say in retrospect. And, it was sort of that year when everything changed again for Duke, because they landed Kyrie Irving, and that was really the first big one and done guy that K was able to get. And as you know, I mean, everything is different about Duke basketball now. And so it turned out to be a peculiar, but also revealing and interesting 4 years to be at Duke and covering the basketball team and sort of chronicling Mike Krzyzewski. And it was, it's kind of odd that, he's retiring 11 years later, because, when I was in school from 2006 until 2010, the talk was always, when is he going to retire and who is going to succeed him? And this has been going on for a very, very long time, and lots of names have come and gone. And it's sort of fitting that Jon Scher, who is in my class and was a senior, that went through those 4 years and knows that kind of odd period of Krzyzewski's career, this interregnum almost, better than anybody, is the guy who is going to succeed him. So when I think about Coach K and the perspective that I have on him, I mean, it's the weirdness of those 4 years, and what became a really interesting time that we didn't really know as it was happening. It sort of only became clear in retrospect. And I'm not sure that even when I graduated, I knew that it would be such an important time of his career.
You talked a little bit about the kind of the juxtaposition between Duke and Kentucky and Carolina during that time period. Can you elaborate a little bit on the Kentucky part of it? Is really interesting to me, because they Calipari got the ball rolling on bringing in 4 or 5 stars and just making it work. Can you just juxtapose that season? I mean, put that in a little bit of context for someone, who may not just fully remember. Both of those teams were 1 seeds, but it felt, I remember as a kid, there was a difference there. And it's by the rest of the country.
It's totally true. And one of the reasons why I think Duke was hiding in plain sight was because Kentucky was such an overwhelming favorite that year. I mean, they had a team that was just stacked with future NBA players. I mean, this was the team of John Wall and Boogie Cousins, and they were dominant all year. And they were dominant coming into the season. And, they were this insane recruiting class, and they were cool, and they had swagger. And it just seemed if Duke was going to win the national championship, it was going to have to be Kentucky. And when you looked at those two teams, despite what every statistical projection said, it just didn't seem possible that Duke was going to beat Kentucky that year. And I remember when Kentucky lost to West Virginia in the Elite Eight, a West Virginia team that, you know, Duke then beat in the Final Four, playing what I think was like easily their best game of the year, and maybe like the best game that they played in 4 years that I was in school. I mean, it was just sort of a perfect game that they played to win that game. You know, once Duke got to the Final Four and Kentucky wasn't there, and instead it was West Virginia and Michigan State and Butler, it just sort of dawned on the entire campus, like, oh my God, Duke is going to win the national championship. Like, it just didn't seem possible before then. Like, Duke hadn't been to the Final Four in, I think, what was it, 6 years then? I mean, it was the first 2008 and 2009. No, I'm sorry about that. 2009 was the first class in like decades that hadn't seen a Final Four in their 4 years. And 2010, it just like, they seemed like a nice team all year long. They won the ACC championship, and that was like this exuberant day on campus. But I don't know if they won the ACC championship. Just scratch that. They beat Carolina, and then they won the ACC tournament. And everything was clicking, but because of that Kentucky team and because of what they represented, it just didn't seem like Duke was going to actually be able to win a title. And that Sunday night, it was just kind of an epiphany. Like, Duke is the favorite now, and it would be sort of shocking if they didn't win the national championship. And like, I still have a very clear memory of like those 3 days, like the Saturday, Sunday, Monday of the Final Four and the national championship on campus, where it was just one of those like perfect April days in Durham where it was like 75 degrees and the entire campus was just on fire. And like, I just looked around and I was like, if you toured this campus today and you were between Duke and any other school in the world, I don't know how you could like not choose Duke. It's just like the perfect existence here right now.
What was it like being on campus you talked a little bit about the Saturday night game, but what was it like being there for the game against Butler, more specifically the Gordon Hayward shot?
So it was funny because I was the Chronicle sports editor as a junior, and the way that the Chronicle worked at that time was that I had dibs on the Final Four as a sophomore and as a junior. Is that right? I think that's right. I definitely had it as a junior. I think I had it as a sophomore too, but as a senior, I knew I was.
It works like that a little bit now, yeah.
Yeah, so I knew I was not going to cover the Final Four as a senior, and there was a question of, you know. There were a bunch of students that drove to the game in Indianapolis. I think it was like a 10-hour drive or something from Durham. And I had to make a decision. Do I want to be in the arena or do I want to be on campus? And my mental calculus at the time was, you know, I think if Duke, what I thought at the time was that let me just phrase this right. What I thought at the time was that there would be more opportunities to see Duke in the Final Four for the rest of my life, but I would never again be able to be on campus as a student when Duke was playing for the national championship. And then, you know, frankly, it was also easier to not drive 10 hours to Indianapolis. And so I watched that game from the Armadillo Grill, which I don't even know if it exists on campus anymore. And like, I think it's where the Loop is now, like in the bottom of the Bryant Center, with, you know, I was just sort of like standing on a bench the whole time. And I think we got to the Dillo at like 3 p.m. that day to get seats that we wanted. And, you know, all my friends were there and people flew down to like watch it here, people who had graduated because they also wanted to be on campus. And, you know, when Zubek was at the line, I remember thinking that it was really weird that it seemed like he had been instructed to miss that second free throw that would have put them up 3. And I still think it was like a horrible decision that they went with that. And, you know, I don't really have a clear memory of when the ball was in the air. I do know that there was like pandemonium in the Dillo when the shot missed. And then at one point I looked up at the TV and it was showing a replay of the shot. And I just thought like, holy shit, like that shot almost went in. And like, it went from like pure jubilation to the acknowledgement that like Duke almost lost on the greatest moment in the history of sport. I mean, I think you could really argue that if Hayward had that shot from half court and Butler had beaten Duke for the national championship, like it's maybe like the most improbable, wildest, craziest moment that sports has ever seen. And I didn't really think about it much more that night. But, I still think about it from time to time now. It was an incredible game. It was a weird game, the Duke Butler game. Like it was low scoring. It was like, it was a slugfest. No team, I think, led by more than like 6 points the whole time. It was like, it was wild. But that I will always sort of remember being in the Dillo that night and just like, watching that ball in the air, realizing it was online, missing, going, bananas, and then taking another look at the shot and thinking like, oh my God, I cannot believe that almost went in.
Here's Andrew Beaton, sports editor during the 2012-2013 season, about what your typical run-of-the-mill Coach K press conference would look like. Some interesting stuff here.
My first experience covering Coach K in earnest was I was a freshman, and I'm covering this game against the University of Virginia. And Kyle Singler, incredible player, was in the middle of a senior funk. And I'm a freshman, I'm covering a Duke basketball game. It is kind of the craziest thing that I've ever done into that point. And I'm sitting in this press conference, and a reporter asks Coach K about Kyle Singler's poor play. And in that moment, I'm not really sure exactly what's going to happen. And Coach K essentially tells the writer, you might not write great stories all the time, but that doesn't mean I think you're a bad reporter. And it was clearly making the point that, okay, a bad game or two doesn't mean that anything about Kyle Singler, the basketball player. And it was this moment that kind of indoctrinated me into what a Coach K press conference is like. And I think when you cover sports for long enough, you can find the rhythm and flow of a lot of coaches and what they say before or after games. And, you have some coaches who are intentionally bland because they don't want to be a soundbite. You have some coaches who relish in saying completely outrageous things. And what makes covering Coach K unique is that he was none of those, and that you didn't know exactly what was on his mind or what he would be thinking when you stepped into that room. And it might not even matter what you ask, because he will say and get out there what he wants to say. Sometimes it'll be biting, sometimes it'll be hilarious, sometimes it will be critical, but it always tended to be pretty interesting. And for a coach to be surprised by what a coach is saying in those circumstances makes it fun, makes it different than covering pretty much anyone else who I have covered in years of covering sports, and after having covered the teams for years, you can build up some banter with him, which I thought was a fascinating thing to watch over the years, because if you cover a college football program, say like Alabama, there might be 150 reporters chasing around. But over the years, the Duke basketball beat wasn't always that big. So as a sports reporter for the Chronicle, you really had an opportunity to distinguish yourself by covering the top basketball program in the country and having people who aren't just Duke students. You have anybody interested in college basketball reading your stories. And so you can stand out when you write interesting stories and ask interesting questions. And one of the things you learn is when you write things, one of your readers might be named Mike Krzyzewski. There was one jokey column I did my senior year where I had written about some fake prop bets for the season. And they were all about like what type of ties Chris Collins would wear, the assistant coach at the time, or things that were all really lighthearted. And one of the ones I wrote about was, a power rankings of who would be in Coach K's doghouse at the end, at some point that season. And so in those doghouse power rankings, it featured then guard Rashid Suleiman, who was slumping at the time. And at a following press conference, something comes up and he looks at me and goes, you know who's in the doghouse? You are. I have one dog, his name is Blue, and he doesn't even live in a house. None of my guys are in a doghouse. And it was this kind of jarring moment where all of a sudden you're trading barbs with Coach K. And one of the things that you realize in a moment like that is Coach K read your column. And in a way that's flattering, but also an important lesson for something when you're a reporter, which is you should expect whenever you write about somebody that people will read it, and you'd be afraid to have your name next to it, because there's a good chance that they will read it and want to call you out on it, and whether it's fair or not fair. I think looking at the career or of that player, I think the doghouse call was pretty on point. And that type of banter evolved over the years. There was a time when, and I asked him about somebody's play. It was such a bland question that I can't even remember what it was. And he responded saying, he would need to watch the film to properly evaluate the play, sort of being like, how could I evaluate the play of this player when the game just ended? And then he asked me, to assess how he performed at that press conference. And I basically replied, well, how could I assess your performance at this press conference? I need to go back and watch the tape. And I still remember his reply was, at least you have empathy for me. This is a kumbaya experience for us. This is terrific. And it's just sort of those moments that really were born out of, when you cover a team, you can build those relationships, build that banter, but it was also covering a coach who is completely unlike every other coach in the country in the way he might engage in those interactions, and that you had no idea what to expect when you walked into that room, because you were covering not just an incredible basketball team, but an interesting personality who might bring up things that you might not expect every day.
That's really interesting. I had heard I think I've read the Doghouse, the prop bets column, and that's really interesting, because we brought back a prop bets type thing last year with the Blue Zone, but it was only spread over under, and that definitely didn't go as into this satire realm. But yeah, so you actually covered the team at, I feel like, at an interesting time, because that was the transition stage where Duke was going after a lot more one and done type guys. Kyrie Irving, Austin Rivers kind of come to mind, Jabari Parker as well. So what was it like kind of covering Coach K, covering the program during that specific time frame?
I've always felt like the people who were in the Duke class of 2014, such as myself, it felt like there was a curse on everyone in that year, because there was a national championship right before they arrived, right before they left. And so, but what I think is important about those years is that they really set the stage for basically what the entire decade of the program would look like. That's when you had Coach K really, for the first time, really successfully recruiting those one and done players who would eventually become what the program was and is. You had the Jabari Parkers, you had the Kyrie Irvings, and one of the things that made that interesting was, not just covering the recruiting and whatnot, but when you're covering those things, you realize you're covering the guys who are going to be the number 1, number 2, number 3 picks in the NBA draft next year. And you only had sometimes a brief window to cover them. There were sometimes strange moments that provided a lot of drama. I wasn't even really covering it at the time, but the whole thing with Kyrie Irving's toe his freshman year was just a fascinating thing to watch unfold, because there was so much mystery around what was going on. And when he had been so electric to start that season, and you go on the years, there's so much hype around Jabari Parker. You have Austin Rivers come in and hit maybe the most unforgettable shot in Duke basketball history. And when you added in an interesting blend of guys who stayed around there for longer, like the Plumlees, you bring in a Seth Curry, who turned out to be a really fantastic shooter and has really made his own way in the NBA. It was a program in many ways in transition, and also started to explain the success that they had the very next year, because they had awesome players. It didn't quite win it all when I was in school, but it all really came together the next year when they had that freshman group that did gel, that had just an extraordinary amount of talent, had the type of point guard that Coach K always dreams of in his point guard, and Tyus Jones. Jahlil Okafor was the type of post player that he always dreamed of. And so what set the stage for a year like that was everything that happened from 2010 to 2014, where those guys came into the program. Duke became a magnet for the top talent in the country, and Coach K proved himself as someone who was developing that talent and turning them into top draft picks.
Next up, we have Amrith Ramkumar. He was actually the sports editor during the 2016-2017 season, but most of our conversation actually centered around the 2015 team for obvious reasons. Here's what he had to say on that team.
A lot of people don't remember, but Duke actually lost 3 games early on in ACC play, and a lot of people, including yours truly, were skewering the team's pick and roll defense, wondering what was going on and not feeling great about things. And then Rashid Suleiman was kicked off the team in late January. depth seemed like a huge issue. There was a lot of negative energy, I would say, building at that time in late January 2015. But it was really incredible. I remember covering the Virginia game at that time, and that's a game that I think really gets lost in really Duke basketball history, recent Duke basketball history, whatever you want to call it. To me, that was the game that turned that entire season around. Virginia hadn't lost a game up until that point. I think they were like number 2, Duke was like number 4, but had lost 3 ACC games already. So people didn't know what to expect, and Tyus Jones and Quinn Cook really ripped the heart out of that arena. It's like a really unique thing to see a Duke team go on the road and silence a packed house like that. So that was pretty unforgettable. And then, yeah, Duke just rode the momentum from that game the rest of the season. They didn't lose the rest of the regular season, lost to Notre Dame to start the ACC tournament, then obviously went on to win the national championship. But yeah, just a few weeks after that Virginia game, like February 2015, like that Duke UNC game at home in Cameron was also bananas. And yeah, seeing like Tyus Jones completely take over and overcome a 10-point deficit in about 4 minutes and sitting center court at Cameron while students were going crazy behind us was also something that is hard to erase from your mind. So yeah, I mean, in all those instances, it's just like Coach K's, I don't want to say hands off, but he always would say after those games, like, I didn't do much. I just let Tyus and Quinn Cook and whoever else go make plays. So it was really notable to me that when the media and everyone else, we were all kind of wondering what was going to happen that season at that critical juncture, Coach K kind of stayed calm and stayed the course, and that team really delivered. And then I didn't get to go cover the national championship that year, but I was obviously watching it and kind of coordinating some of the editing and publishing stuff. And yeah, that is also something I'll never forget, publishing the story for the Chronicle that Duke just won its 5th national championship. And those were the days when we had to do both web and print. So it was a super late night, but doing all of that at the same time was pretty amazing. So yeah, I have a lot of awesome memories from that year. And it was just, again, crazy, the amount of news and the amount of the volume of insane games, insane comebacks, amazing performances. I mean, that Notre Dame team that year that beat Duke in the ACC tournament and went on to go to the Elite Eight and nearly beat Kentucky, that was undefeated in that game. Duke just eviscerated that Notre Dame team early on in ACC play. I think that was one of the best college basketball games from a single team I've ever seen. So yeah, covering that team was pretty awesome.
What was it like seeing the relationship between Coach K and Tyus Jones? He obviously always has a interesting dynamic with his point guards, and especially I feel like Tyus and Trey, those two have been very close to K over the years. What was it like, that kind of dynamic?
Yeah, that 2014-15 team was fascinating in so many ways, especially the Quinn Cook, Tyus Jones situation. People didn't really know who was going to play point guard most of the time or have the ball in their hands at the end of games and all of that. And it just became clear over the course of the season. I didn't even mention like Coach K's 1000th win against St. John's in January 2015. Like Tyus Jones just had this knack for making huge plays with the ball in his hands, and so did Quinn Cook. So the fact that he was willing to trust Tyus so much so early on, even when he had Quinn and potentially other options, I think said a lot about how he adapted. And I mean, that's clearly the defining thing that he always talks about that's made him so successful. He's changed his style and kind of relinquished control to really young players when he sees the chance to and knows they can deliver. And I mean, the way Tyus closed out so many games that season and then the championship is one of the greatest clutch seasons by a freshman, I think, that a lot of us have ever seen. So it was really cool to see how that evolved and how Tyus and Quinn and everyone else kind of coexisted. And yeah, I think, again, it worked really well. I think if a few weeks in late January and February had not gone like they did, if Tyus and Quinn and all those other guys hadn't delivered so well, we might be having a different conversation. But the fact that they played so well at that critical 2-week stretch really changed a lot.
Hank Tucker served as sports editor during the 2017-18 season, obviously known as the Marvin Bagley year by many. Our conversation stretched beyond that season, though, as Hank reflected on having an up-close look at the program and the coach that he grew up idolizing as a Durham native.
It was, almost surreal in a way to, be in the same room with him, asking him questions. I got to interview him one-on-one once for, a story, feature, kind of a profile I did for when he turned 70, for how he still got to relate to his players. So that was cool after my sophomore year. But, it was, interesting to see, how, I kind of thought of him as almost, he was still kind of humanized to me growing up. I was sort of familiar with his family. His grandkids went to my school. His daughter taught at my school. Both my parents went to Duke, and so I'd go to games. But obviously he was just this kind of almost, superhuman, figure in Durham, just like the most, famous guy. And you don't really see him out very much. But, just to be able to, interact with him, personally, through covering the team through school, and you kind of get to know kind of his tendencies and how obviously he's not obviously, I think he's the greatest college basketball coach of all time at what he does, but still sometimes you kind of roll your eyes that his answers are kind of rambling, and he goes on these digressions that it's like, okay, Coach K. But no, it was really a lot of fun, and you can sometimes learn a lot from him, and just discussing, and you always had to be sure you had a good question ready if you were going to ask, because he can jump on you if he doesn't really like your question. But I think he always kind of respected me when he heard from me when I would speak up at a press conference, and we built kind of a I obviously had respect for him, but I wouldn't hesitate to write something critical if it was a bad loss or a bad game, and it wasn't really a problem for me transitioning from the fan phase, even though when I wasn't covering a game, I would always go stand in line and wait and be a camera crazy, but then I could put on my reporter hat too, and kind of evaluate things more objectively, and it was obviously a lot of fun, and just to kind of almost a dream in a way to do that as well, considering just growing up around the program, going to games, and being such a fan.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of learning some of his tendencies. So if there was one thing you had to say that you realized or learned about Coach K that you just didn't know before you started coming to Duke, what would that be?
I think just kind of a little bit kind of his sense of humor in a way, but often in a way that not demeaning to people, but he'll kind of have a sarcastic response, or kind of he's not always the most diplomatic in the way he responds to questions if he doesn't like what you're asking about, or if he just doesn't, or if he's just mad about a loss or something. He's so competitive, which you always know, but you kind of learn that if it's a bad loss, and you kind of read his mood, and if you're not going to get a good answer, or if he's not in the mood to provide much insight. He usually is, if you kind of get at the right thing, but he can kind of be sarcastic, and his frustration can kind of show sometimes, but I think in general he's always respectful of whoever's talking to him, and his players, but so when you're covering a game at Cameron, you don't always it's hard to hear him since you're across the court, but I was in a couple of games. I covered a game against Elon at the Greensboro Coliseum my sophomore year. That was actually the game Grayson Allen tripped whoever Elon's player was, and he ended up getting suspended for a game. But I was kind of pretty close to the bench for that game, just the way they configured the media. And that was the closest I was ever to Coach K during a game, just kind of, so you could kind of hear how he interacted with his players, use some colorful language at times with the players and the refs, which, you kind of hear about, but, seeing that firsthand, and just his passion, his intensity, was, kind of a lot, and just, eye-opening in a way.
That's one of the things I've heard about and read about is maybe not more so now as he's gotten older, but when he was younger, practices, games, ACC tournaments, there were some heated moments. I remember reading some things about, they became really good friends, but some heated moments with Dean Smith. I think, some a comment that Dean Smith might have made about Duke and the officials, and Coach K kind of jabbing back at him during a game. So that's interesting. So you mentioned a little bit, games that you covered, but you also covered three ACC tournaments in a row. Obviously, Duke winning two of those, and who could forget the 2019 game playing UNC in the semifinals? But if you had to pick a moment from those 3 years, those three ACC tournaments, obviously they were super memorable. Well, what game kind of stands out in your mind?
I mean, it's got to be that Zion's game, in 2019 against UNC. That whole year was just so much fun. I mean, I wasn't on campus for a championship, but the Zion year was almost as good as something in my mind. I wish they weren't mutually exclusive, and that team could have gone all the way, but they came up short against Michigan State. In the Elite Eight. But the ACC tournament, when Zion, he had been hurt in the first play of the first game against UNC, his shoe exploded. It was giant, public, all this attention came down on Duke. And then so he was hurt for a few weeks. He missed that second game against UNC. We lost both of those games. And then he came back the next week for the ACC tournament, was his first, week back from that injury. And he played great against Syracuse in the quarterfinals. I don't know if he missed a shot or he might have missed one. He was like 13 for 14 or something like that.
Yeah, he missed one or something like that. It was crazy efficiency.
That was a crazy game. And then the UNC game, and that was a great UNC team with Kobe White and Cam Johnson, and they were one of the best teams in the nation too that year. And both teams just played so well that night, and both teams were at full strength for like the first time, the only time of that year. And Zion, there was a play late in the second half and it was close. He got a steal and got a dunk. And there's a picture of that I still have as my background on my computer, my Facebook cover photo that I'm sure is hanging in the Chronicle office still. I'm in the background covering the game with our sports editor at the time, Michael, that our great photographer Bree Bradham got, as Zion was in the air on that dunk with Kobe White behind him, which was kind of just one of the signature plays of that game. And then, him making the go-ahead, put back with less than a minute left, and then Duke ended up getting, a stop or two at the end to clinch it. But, that in terms of just a single game that was so memorable, that one stands out. And then the next day, we finished it off against Florida State. But, really the UNC game is the one that stands out in my mind.
Mitchell Gladstone was Hank's managing editor that year. During our conversation, we talked a lot about that 2017-18 team. Here's why Mitchell thinks that's a pretty underappreciated group in terms of recent Duke history.
Getting to cover the 2017-18 Duke team, it's one of those teams that I guess in some ways, gets lost in the shuffle. They had a Marvin Bagley, they had Wendell Carter, they had Trey Duval. I mean, that was one of those teams that was, potentially a Final Four championship winning team. And, it gets lost in the shuffle because you had a Jason Tatum the year before and you had Zion and RJ the year after. And so, I think it gets underappreciated. They didn't make an ACC tournament run. They lost in the semifinals to North Carolina. They didn't make it to the Final Four. None of those teams did. But, there were just so many memories from that team. For me personally, that was also what was underrated was that was senior year Grayson Allen. And I had gotten at that point, that was my junior year. So I'd gotten to cover 2 years of Grayson Allen. And I think one of the things that people don't appreciate, and I don't think I definitely didn't appreciate as a student reporter, was the ability to have an open locker room and get to go in and spend time with these players. Certainly it's been different the last year plus with COVID and, having locker rooms closed, but being able to go into the locker room all the time, I got to spend a lot of time with those guys. And I always tell everyone, I don't necessarily have a favorite player per se. I mean, perhaps it was Jay Williams, perhaps it was JJ Redick. Those were the guys I watched growing up as a kid. But one of my favorites to cover, probably my favorite to cover by far, was Grayson Allen. He and I, that was I guess he had the last of his sort of real serious outburst at the beginning of my sophomore year. And I remember getting to cover the one game at Virginia Tech on New Year's Eve when he wasn't playing in his one game indefinite suspension. But then he came back, and really at that point, from that point on, so halfway through his junior year, through his senior year, was a really different person. I think he was always very articulate, but he took on much more of a leadership role, was calmer, and me personally, I love getting to, I think one of the unique things about Duke basketball that you don't get covering any other college team, no one else has an open locker room. So, getting to be in there and, getting to be around those guys, and Grayson and I, developed a really good relationship where I don't even know if he knew my name. I hope he did. I hope Coach K knew my name a lot of the time, but those guys, they knew my face. They knew the type of questions I was going to ask them. And I remember, I think I talked with Grayson the day before the Elite Eight, when they lost to Kansas in Omaha. I was there, and I got to talk about, just sort of the family aspect of having their families in the stands. I think Wendell Carter had talked about having his family and what that meant to him. But also how they all had sort of become their own family, their own family as players and brothers, and the coaches. And so he and I had a really long conversation in the locker room. I remember someone else wanted to get in, and I was like, "Look, I'm here. I'm having a conversation with someone who I've developed a relationship with." And so I think that was really cool. And then it was one of the stranger feelings was I was able to. I remember after that game, that was the only time I ever covered. Well, it's not. I shouldn't say that. That's not true. I covered the 2016-17 first, second round. So I saw them lose at South Carolina. Or I say lose at South Carolina. It basically was at South Carolina, but it was technically a neutral site game in Greenville. But I saw them lose to Kansas in that Elite Eight game that would have sent them to the Final Four. And I had the chance to sort of just go around and acknowledge these guys. I mean, I've never since then. I don't think I've ever seen Grayson or Wendell or Marvin again. That was the last time I was ever going to get to cover them. And it's a weird thing when you how do you interact with these guys, because at the same, as much as they're soon to be NBA players, they're also people and someone you've developed a relationship with. So I shook their hands. I said thank you. I mean, that's part of building a relationship. And so I think, beyond all the stuff of Coach K and Duke basketball and, soon to be NBA guys, like they're still just people, and, getting to cover them in person and be up close and be in their space, really, which there are, things that's a different topic for a different time. That's a thing that's very unique to covering Duke basketball.
Right. That definitely resonates. I was just say that, that 17-18 team, I think is really almost unique, because that whole strategy of playing with two big men and having kind of an inside out game, because Wendell Carter was obviously a better shooter than maybe some people gave him credit for. So, how do you think that team kind of stands out just from a basketball strategy perspective? Because I don't know, it's just interesting how they went from playing kind of their NBA style of high pick and roll, spread the floor, to now they're going with two big men kind of pounding it inside. And then the next year, obviously they went to 5 out. How does that team, how does it stand out to you from a basketball perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, like I said, you do sort of forget that team. There are things that are less memorable about it. I mean, you look at the 2017, and I talk about, this, I guess, 16, 17, and 18, 19, the teams that played in the, that won ACC tournaments. Those teams really stand out because of what they did at the end of the year. And you remember those events, those weekends, to sort of cap off the season, even if they didn't make it, to a Final Four. I think, sort of those are sort of the marking points. And obviously that 2018-19, you had a bunch of memorable games: Louisville, Kentucky, Virginia with the block. I was actually there, fortunately, for Louisville and Virginia, and those games are just sort of seared in my memory. But I think, just what the 2017-18 team, I don't know that you're ever gonna see that again. It was one of those weird circumstances where Duke just recruited the guys that were there, and it happened to be that Carter and Bagley were those top guys. I don't know what the plan. I think the plan evolved as the year went on. I think the view always was that Bagley was going to maybe be able to develop into a shooter, and he never really did, at least at Duke. I don't know whether they just didn't try or not. But it was really interesting just to see them. I mean, there were games when it was just like, hey, let's put the ball in Duval's hands. Let's get it up on the glass because we know we're getting the board and we're going to put it back. I mean, there were just, I can just think of the North Carolina game. And honestly, I don't remember a lot of the specifics of that game. I was covering it. So as far as, how everything went, I don't remember certain plays, but, I remember being in Cameron. Hank, my sports editor at the time, would tell you that he was not happy with his game story that night. I thought it was actually pretty good. But the headline was animal time. And, that was something that was a direct quote because someone called Marvin Bagley an animal. And we can get into whether that was the best headline, but the idea was that, he really just was a beast on the glass. Anytime there was a ball that wound up in his hands, you knew that he was getting a second chance opportunity. He had an incredible second leap. Like, he would just get the ball and almost like he would come down, but not, it felt like he never actually touched the ground, and he would just sort of go right back up. It was just such a, like you said, it's a weird team because Bagley hasn't had, a ton of NBA success in the way that Jason Tatum has. I mean, he's that guy was super polished, ready to be an NBA All-Star pretty much from the day he arrived in Durham. And I remember thinking that if we're going to be honest, I remember I wanted to rip Jason Tatum about late January of his season because I thought he was overhyped and not producing, and I was wrong on that. So I will cop to that. But no, Jason Tatum, super polished, ready to go. Zion, I mean, just absolutely dominant for college basketball. RJ Barrett, I mean, I know I think people underappreciate him because just of who he played with Cam Reddish, who I know some people say that he's the most talented guy on that team. I don't know that I necessarily agree, but you lose. It's easy to lose perspective because of what that run of recruiting was for Duke, and so I think, but when like you said, those guys, neither Bagley nor Carter has been like some great NBA player yet, but I mean, look, people clearly valued Wendell Carter in a trade. People have talked about trading Marvin Bagley. It's not like these guys are schlubs by any means, and that team made it to the Elite Eight because they had the two of them plus Grayson Allen. So I think it's easy to forget that team. I'll always remember being in Omaha and just watching the ball from Grayson sort of spin around the rim and out. Because I would have gotten to go to a Final Four. I never got to go to a Final Four. It's the one thing that, of all the things that I was lucky enough to do at Duke, covering Duke basketball, being in the band as well, getting to a Final Four was the one thing I didn't get to do. And I hope that as long as Duke basketball is going, everyone, be it from the Chronicle, be it a student, be it in the band, whatever, you get to, whether you go to a Final Four or you experience it on campus. There was that run, I guess, from like 2001 to 2010, where there were a bunch of classes that didn't get to experience that. And I think just experiencing that and being a part of it on campus. I know I got to experience it as a high schooler, seeing my team play a state championship twice my freshman and sophomore year. And so, I just know that that Final Four experience is something that everybody I hope gets a chance to have. And so, seeing this team, start to put the pieces in place to have sort of reboot that, given that the last 2 years have been pretty iffy. Obviously, one season ended by COVID, and one season that was just not great. But I think it's something that I hope everyone in some form or fashion at Duke gets to experience, because that's part of why I was interested, why I wanted to be a part of Duke, is that it's a culture, it's a spirit, and however you get to experience it, I have to almost do it as a Chronicle managing editor. I almost got to do it as a senior again. So I hope everyone gets the chance to sort of live that in some form or fashion at Duke.
Here's Michael Modell on getting access to what he saw as this sort of mythical program growing up. A lot of the same themes that Hank touched on here. Some really interesting things, especially about the 2018-19 season, which Michael was the editor for.
My first real experiences with Coach K wasn't really an experience, but it was just more of a factor of my relationship with the team and how I was able to sort of break this bubble and finally be able to get access. I grew up a Duke fan. My father went to Duke, and so I was watching, JJ Redick and all of those guys throughout my childhood. And Coach K was this, the GOAT, the greatest of all time. I was at Coach K's 1000th game, and just growing up wanting to go to Duke, wanting to be a part of this, but I never really imagined that I would get the access that I was able to. And so when I first started covering the team, it was really scary and intimidating to sit in the press room with Coach K. On one hand, you have all of these local media guys and national media guys who've been covering the team for 20 years. And I was here as a student journalist who wasn't really interested in writing, didn't really know that much, kind of just joined the Chronicle because I wanted to get involved with the basketball team without having to attend. And, it kind of spiraled. And it took me 5 games to ask Coach K a question. And I think for me, there is this worry of making sure that, if you get Coach K's respect, right? Is he going to respect you? You're talking to this sort of immortal, college basketball presence. He's been through a lot. He's heard all the great questions. He's heard the dumb questions. You've heard, the other reporters throughout the Chronicle tell you about the times that, they've asked the wrong question, have been shut down before. And not necessarily in a bad way, but it was really, it took time. I would sit there in the press room, writing down my questions in advance. And then, of course, started with the basic thing like, oh, what did you think of, Bagley's performance, which of course is the first question from every single other reporter. So then you pivot and try and think about, what else you're going to say. And I think that for me, one thing that really helped me was trying to focus on some of the other guys, right? Once you get a sense of the press room and get a sense of what people are going to ask about, right? All the national guys, they're going to ask about the freshman of the year, right? They're going to ask about the top guy. They're going to ask about the leading scorer. And so I really tried to, find those unheralded heroes. There was a game I covered where J-Rob had, 10 points off the bench. Another game where Jordan Goldwire made some great plays in the ACC tournament, which are really game changing. And so by trying to focus on those, I was able to make sure that, I always had a question that I could ask, right? I knew no one else was going to ask that. And it also put pressure on me because if I didn't ask that, I wasn't going to have something to write about. And I think Coach K really appreciated that. He loves talking about those guys that no one else talks about, whether it's, asking, why Joey Baker didn't play against Kentucky and whether or not, he was to be redshirted or, again, asking about Goldwire or Justin Robinson. Coach K really loves all of the guys on his team, top to bottom. And, again, you have some guys, especially with these one and done teams that take all the attention. He really appreciated the attention that some of these other guys get. And so I think that finding that lens was really helpful. I think another thing that was really useful for us, and one thing that I was especially proud of, is the fact that during my 4 years, and especially my time as sports editor, we covered every single Duke basketball event, and we sent at least one person to every event, which is something that no other organization can say. I went with Winston to Maui, which I know he talked a lot about. I also spent 3 days covering the team in Canada, and that was a really eye-opening experience for me. So beginning of that year with Zion, RJ, Cam, and Trey, the team spent 3 days in Canada. They played spent 5 days playing 3 games, 2 in Toronto and 1 in Montreal. And again, it was an interesting opportunity for the team to sort of bond a little bit. A lot of the past international tours have been kind of overseas, and here was Duke in Canada selling, out 20,000 person arenas for these games, which was pretty crazy. And it was really interesting, at least for me, looking back on it, right? Going into the locker room and you see all of these guys huddling over to RJ because RJ is the local Canadian guy, and I would go over to hang out with Zion because no one wanted to talk to him, which was pretty mind-boggling at the time. But again, I think during those experiences when it was just me there, or even when we were covering road games and, it was one other local guy and then the Chronicle guys, I feel like Coach K really was able to recognize us. I think that was one thing that was really powerful being a beat writer, was I really feel like, even though we didn't know each other personally, right, he clearly recognized who we were. He was always respectful to us, as long as we asked respectful questions and reasonable questions. But he clearly, he clearly appreciated our presence, and I think that itself was really powerful.
This was a fun one. So here's Winston Lindqwister talking the Trey Jones, Wendell Moore UNC win, and when him and Michael took a nice little trip to Maui to cover the Zion RJ team. Winston was Michael's sports managing editor. Quick note here, apologies for some of the audio issues with this one. We were recording in the office and some of the sound was a little off, so sorry about that. But here's Winston.
I've actually been really lucky in my coverage time of being able to cover a lot of really close and exciting games. And a few buzzer beaters before that, but that was the first time it was 2 buzzer beaters in one game, which is the coolest thing ever. Michael's probably gonna kill me for this, but after the first one with Trey, he jumped up in the press stand, and I had to hold him to the side because he was so excited. It was so sick though. It was the most exciting game I've ever been to. And the post game was crazy. So it was basically in the locker room was Wendell Moore and Trey Jones, in the middle of the locker room, just everybody was swarming them because they just both made a permanent UNC Duke rivalry highlight tapes for the next decade. But afterwards, Coach K, in victory, he was very gracious about what happened and complimented UNC. But also with Coach K, there's a slight air of I don't want to say smugness, but he was quite pleased with himself. So it was a very, very exciting game and a very exciting night for a game that looked for 98% of it to be incredibly disappointing. So it was probably my favorite coverage experience. And yeah.
That's one thing I've noticed is sometimes you can go back to a season and just remember what happened in the Duke UNC game. You can forget every other game almost. Just because that UNC team that year, it's hard to remember, that was a really bad UNC team. They were well below 500. Cole Anthony missed a bunch of games. Garrison Brooks was kind of the only guy there for a bit, but it seemingly didn't matter. It was still a top 3 Duke UNC game I've ever seen, maybe number 1. And just the last 2 minutes of regulation and last really all of overtime, I mean, that was incredible seeing that. And what was it like, with Trey Jones and Wendell? What did they kind of say post game that really stood out to you then?
I'm gonna be honest, I couldn't hear anything they were saying because the locker room was so loud. I just remember them dancing around the whole time, and
right,
just cheering everywhere. So it's kind of funny. Like, yeah, that UNC team really wasn't that great. But I do remember literally like a week before or a week after that, Cole Anthony said that he felt they were playing like a top 10 team at the time. And I actually really think that if they managed to beat Duke and in either of the two matchups, I feel like their season would have kept going in a much more positive trajectory. But yeah, no, I think everybody was like, whether it was a down year for UNC or not, everybody was so happy from it. And I mean, just like the coming back from an almost, I think it was a 20-point deficit at one point. That's insane. Like, Trey really put the team on his back.
Yeah.
The last, as you said, last 2 minutes of regulation, almost the entirety of overtime, it was the Trey Jones show. And, some other people were there too.
I think Vernon Carey fouled out with 5 minutes left.
And Cassius.
And Cassius had a really good game up until that point when he fouled out.
I mean, I don't even know if I'd say really good game. It's just they were better than everybody else, but everybody else was playing horribly. So
Right. So you also, on another interesting note, you also covered the Maui Invitational with Michael your junior year, your managing editor year. That was obviously the Zion RJ team. So just what was that like? I mean, you guys were there for almost a week, just on the beach covering basketball. What was that like?
It was so much fun. To this day, I don't know how Michael managed to finesse that. It was the first time I've ever taken photos that were used for an article. Like I had no reason to be there. But in terms of like the tournament and just like being around that team, it was incredible. Though, although they ended up losing the Gonzaga game, it was still a really good game. Like all three of their games up to that point were really fun. Coach K was super. He's like really positive through the whole thing, which I mean, he usually doesn't get grumpy until like conference play, and you really get into like the doldrums of the season. But for non-conference play, he was genuinely like really happy with his team and really proud of his players, which was cool to see, And even though, like as a Duke fan, it kind of sucked to see Duke leave Maui with a loss. It was still just a really positive experience.
Next up, we have Derek Saul, sports editor during the 2019-2020 season. Derek talked a lot about Coach K having to adjust to that team in the wake of Zion, RJ, and Cam Reddish departing. He also reflected on the way that season ended due to the pandemic.
So I covered the team from, I guess it was 2018 to 2019 season until the 2020 to 21 season. And I was the sports editor for the 2019 to 2020 season. And most significant about my term as sports editor is that it ended with the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in the United States. And so had a lot of craziness at the end of the year there. But really for the beginning of my covering the team, I was a beat writer for the men's basketball team my sophomore year. And that was the Zion Williamson and also RJ Barrett year. And I'm sure you heard a lot of fun stories from Michael Modell about that, but that was absolute chaos and so fun to cover. There's a lot of times that after games and post-game press conferences, just seeing Coach K smiling ear to ear, and just that team was so fun, and they lost in the Elite Eight, but I think that was just about as, maybe not as successful on the court from the on-court perspective, but it was definitely an A+ in terms of team to cover, and just the vibes around the team were really, really exciting. But in my year sports editor, and then my senior year that followed, I think got to learn a lot more about Coach K, because him and the team faced a lot more adversity than he was used to. There was a big talent drop off. I should say. I think any schmuck could coach Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett to go score on other 18-year-olds. But once that top level talent is gone, just responding to that. And then I think over the last 2 years, I hope this is true, but Duke hasn't had a lottery pick over the previous 2 seasons, and my last 2 seasons covering the team. So getting to see Coach K respond to that was definitely interesting. And so in the 2019-20 season, Duke was still very good, but again, they weren't that dominant level team. If the NCAA tournament had happened, they probably would have been the 3 seed. But got to see a lot of good leadership from Coach K, but I think also kind of started to see the writing on the wall that maybe his time at Duke was starting to become numbered. So in January of that season, there's this really weird incident where Coach K erupted on the Cameron Crazies, who were taunting Pitt head coach Jeff Capel, who previously played at Duke and coached at Duke. And there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, but freaked out, yelled at the student section to shut up, didn't back down, and post-game press conference. And there was a lot of craziness with that. I remember actually I wasn't covering the game. I was editing for the game. I was back in my dorm room, and just the firestorm that followed that was absolutely wild to see and to push back. I remember the headline monitor wasn't too happy with me about our coverage about that. And then ended up that Coach K randomly pulled some tenters from Kville and brought them into Cameron to sort of apologize and say, give an explanation into his headspace. So that was definitely the weirdest, weirdest experience with Coach K over my time. And then 6 weeks after that, the season was canceled. And I think a small but important part of Coach K's legacy was, putting his players' safety first. And Duke a lot of it was from President Price, but Duke was really the school that got the ACC tournament canceled. Duke said we wouldn't play, and Price and Coach K were a part of that. And then I think going into the next season where, no nice way to put it, Duke sucked. They were horrible last season. And there's definitely a lot of times that there was frustration from Coach K, and, maybe he wasn't at his peak X's and O's wise. But I think he did a good job really, keeping the morals high, and standing up for what the team believed in. He's always been, for years and years before there was much more steam on it, he was a huge advocate for players' rights. But before the NIL legislation existed, he's always really been someone that thinks that student athletes aren't treated properly, and looking out for their best financial interest, their best health interest. And so I think so I think that's definitely a really important part of his legacy that's shown through from K, despite not having the on-court success that he had grown accustomed to.
Right. That's an interesting perspective. I definitely, having been here the last couple of years, seeing him, he's always, not afraid to speak his mind, but, him, like you said, him, kind of being with his players and being in favor of their safety versus, the entire people were obviously, saying that they should continue college basketball. I don't think no one really understood the pandemic, me included. I was, 18 years old, 19 years old back then, but And yeah, so just seeing that, and then kind of some of the protests that he led. I mean, you could say he led. Nolan Smith kind of led some of them last year in Cable. So that's definitely an interesting, like you said, small but interesting part of his legacy. So you actually, what's interesting is you kind of covered until Friday. I was at Countdown to Craziness with Glenn Morgenstern, one of our other beat writers, but that was the first time that there have been fans in Cameron for a men's basketball event since the UNC game, your sports editor year 2020, March 7th, I believe. So can you just talk about the experiences covering that game? Obviously, no one really knew what was to come after that, just a couple days later. But what were the experiences covering that game, and what memories do you have just looking back on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really, I'm going to use this as a personal story. I can't remember anything super related to Coach K here. But even though, he was someone that was pretty aware of the pandemic early, and, was someone that was pretty quickly understood the implications of everything, took things very seriously. So that was Saturday. That was the Saturday that started our spring break. And so it was totally normal there were no restrictions. It was fully fans spitting and sweating and bleeding on each other. I don't know if there's blood, but I assume there was. There's a lot of grossness going on in the student section. And so I was covering it alongside with the managing editor of my year, McLeod. And so I remember for the first time, that's the first time I ever really thought about COVID. And I was like, wow, there's a lot of people in here. This is a little weird. And I remember after covering the game, which was great, really exciting game, Duke beat North Carolina, exciting close game. I remember being up in the office and finishing up all our coverage from the night. And I remember having a little thought in my head. I was like, I might not come back. I might not come back from spring break. There's a chance that there's not that, COVID becomes worse. And, I think that game was really the first time that people thought oh, wow, there could be serious implications to this. And then I came back to New Jersey. I was supposed to come back for the ACC tournament in Greensboro, which started, I think, Thursday. Duke would have started. And so end up deciding Wednesday night I have a flight, and I go to eventually I decide, really conflicted whether I should cover or not. And then there's really a lot of steam picking up on whether it's right for people to be playing, yada, yada. So I end up Wednesday. My mom came on my flight with me because we were going to pack up my Durham dorm room, expecting that things were going to get canceled. And so we packed stuff up. And then I'm eating dinner at the Irwin Road Chipotle in Durham, and the Rudy Gobert news breaks, and then come to the conclusion I don't feel comfortable covering the game. Ends up that before the game even starts, Duke and Coach K and Price pull Duke out, ACC tournament's canceled, and so life goes on. And then I remember I wrote, I was driving back up from North Carolina to New Jersey with my mom, and we pulled over at a place in Virginia so I could get our coverage done on all the Duke spring sports and winter sports getting canceled. So yeah, that was absolutely crazy. Unfortunately, I don't have an amazing Coach K tie in there, but that was a wild experience. And I mean, that totally makes sense, but it's really weird to think about that it's been almost 2 full years, and that's the last time a Chronicle reporter or any Duke student that's not on the basketball team has been inside Cameron.
One of the things about Coach K that has really been a constant over the years is the great point guard play of his teams, as well as his relationships with those floor generals. Connor McLeod, who was the sports managing editor during the 2019-2020 season, along with Derek, talks a lot about Trey Jones and his relationship with Coach K.
So definitely my favorite game that I covered during my time on the Chronicle, and something I'm always going to remember is, might be cliche, but just definitely my time being able to see the UNC game in person in Cameron. And that was really special to me for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, I didn't have to attend or anything. I just got to walk into the best game of the year every year. And also it was the last game before COVID hit Duke for me. And so it was my last game covering in person. And I didn't know that at the time, but definitely special now thinking back on it. We won that game, which was huge. And I also got to see my favorite Duke player that I got to watch go off, Tre Jones. Definitely my favorite player and probably my favorite point guard I've ever seen in college basketball. Just a really good leader on the court, and I really like watching people who love playing defense. And you could really tell, like, from the first time he stepped foot on Cameron, he really wanted to make defense a priority. So I really fell in love with his game, and seeing him be able to get a double-double in that game was really special for me to watch and cover. I got to interview him after the game. Like I said, I didn't know it was going to be my last game covering. I didn't know it was going to be my last game covering that team. I didn't know it was my last game covering Cameron, but that's definitely one of my favorite memories as managing editor and just on the Chronicle staff in general. And that team had a lot of potential. So I'm happy that I ended up seeing them with a win, especially against a team like North Carolina, who I don't think they were good that year, but it was still a good game, as it always is. So, yeah, that was definitely my favorite moment. In terms of press conferences, Coach K's press conferences are pretty special, I think, pretty unique, in that, like, you really have to be on top of your game as a reporter. You really have to make sure you're asking the right questions and not wasting anybody's time. Like, if you ask a bad question, not only is everybody else in the room who's covering Duke basketball going to be upset, but Coach K is definitely going to be upset. He's going to let you know that he's upset. And so there's been a couple of times when I haven't asked maybe the best question I could have, and definitely got maybe a little bit embarrassed in the press conferences. But I think in the long run, it's a good thing for me. Learning how to, like, be efficient in what I'm doing in my work. So I don't have any specific moments, but I do know that being in those press conferences with Coach K definitely made me a better reporter.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about Tre Jones, and I was a freshman that year, and he was, obviously the face of the program on the court, at least. So I was a huge fan of his. And how do you think his relationship with Coach K? I mean, Coach K always has kind of a unique relationship with his point guards. How do you think that the relationship between those two kind of played out that season?
I mean, I don't know specifics, but I mean, obviously Tre Jones' brother was on the 2015 team that won. Tyus Jones was the point guard then. So I'm sure that Coach K knew Tre Jones for a long time, even before he stepped foot on Duke's campus. So I think that's pretty important. And you can kind of tell that Tre Jones felt really comfortable in that position, and Coach K really felt comfortable handing over a lot of leadership opportunities to Tre Jones, especially in his freshman season with players like Cam Reddish, Zion, RJ on the team, who, like, those players are definitely more talented than him in terms of basketball and, like, athleticism. But you could tell that Coach K put a lot of trust into Tre Jones that year, because Tre Jones really controlled the ball for most of the year, even though he had such stars on the team. So I guess the relationship between him and Coach K definitely, like, helped him gain confidence, and that's, I think, really important for a point guard, especially leading a team at such a young age, like as a freshman. And so he got a lot of experience that year, and then him coming back from his second year, I think you can also chalk that up to him having a really good relationship with Coach K, because I don't know if he would have gotten drafted, but he could have. But he decided to stay for second year, and he clearly, like, grew even more during that summer, because he was even better that second year. Like, he developed a jump shot, developed, like, a pull-up game. And so I don't know, that I guess the trust between him and Coach K was very, very obvious from the time he stepped foot on Duke's campus.
So we're actually getting a little closer to the end here, unfortunately, but Here's Evan Kolin, sports editor during last season. He talks about Coach K's role as an advocate for change within college basketball over the years.
It's definitely an aspect of Coach K that most people don't really see. You know, everyone is sort of focused on the success he's had on the floor. But yeah, one of the biggest things that stood out in sort of the first year I was covering him, my sophomore year, which is the 2019-20 season, was how his sort of thoughts on the future of the sport. And I know I was just covering the Gonzaga game out in Las Vegas, and Mark Few said after the game, you know, one of the things that, you know, one of the questions to him was just talk about Coach K's legacy. And one of the things he mentioned is that, you know, not a lot of people see what he does behind the scenes, and a lot of the committees that both Mark and Coach K are in, and that's sort of an aspect of Coach K that he's been able to see. And, you know, it really speaks to him on just the kind of coach he is and the kind of person he is that, again, like a lot of people don't really get to witness with him just coaching on the sidelines. But yeah, just throughout that 2019-20 season, and it wasn't just once, just really in a variety of games, you know, whether it be early in the season, even in like ACC, you know, preseason ACC media day before the season began, he was constantly talking about, you know, college basketball and the future of the sport in relation to NIL, in relation to, you know, avenues such as the G League opening up for players, you know, to start making, you know, bypassing colleges, going straight there and then to the NBA. And it was just really, you know, I could talk about this for a while, but it was just interesting to know that he's, you know, even as his career was, you know, winding down, he's aware of sort of the state of college basketball and then the future of the sport overall.
It seems like, from my understanding, he always talks about a need for like a centralized leader of just college basketball. Like he always said the NCAA isn't really equipped to handle like the specifics of the sport while also handling all the other sports. Is that kind of what you got from him?
Yeah, so I wrote an article on sort of, you know, just before I get into that specifically, I wrote an article sort of that takes everything he said throughout the year and put it in one place. So and throughout that, yeah, one of the things he mentioned was specifically, you know, there's all these problems facing college basketball, whether it be NIL, whether it be these, you know, competing G League, you know, the overtime league has come up in the last couple of years as well. And, you know, one of the things he mentioned was, all right, you know, who's coming out and who's the one person we look to give a response to problems such as this, and trying to help the future of college basketball, you know, a sport that many people think is, you know, dwindling with all of these competitors rising up. And he said, you know, we don't have a commissioner. We don't have that one person to look to. And that's something he said that he's tried to advocate for years and decades. And, you know, it hasn't come to fruition. So that was another aspect related to that I thought was interesting was, you know, he said, you know, this is, you know, he's saying this in the press conferences, but, you know, he talks about how he's been saying this kind of stuff behind closed doors for a while. And even as big as he is in the college basketball world, you'd think whatever Coach K says, people will listen. You know, even he directly said, it's like, you know, I've been saying this for years. So obviously, you know, the stuff I'm saying, you know, it's not direct, you know. I think he actually even said, obviously what I'm saying doesn't matter, which I'm sure isn't exactly true. But it was surprising to see that he's had these opinions and still nothing has sort of came from them, I guess.
Next to last, we have Shane Smith, who was last year's sports managing editor. Shane reminisces on covering his first Duke game during his freshman year, which happened to be the Zion RJ year.
I was a freshman. I was kind of thrown into the fire for a Duke St. John's game in the Zion RJ Cam year. And, I mean, the game was great overall. It had, you know, big run by Zion, and the crowd was great. But to me, the thing that always stand out, I mean, going to Duke games when I was young and watching, you know, every game, every year, there's always that moment when Coach K takes his jacket off at home to really get the crowd just like pumped up. And you know, if Duke needs a spark, like Coach K will rip his jacket off, throw it over the scorer's table and start pumping the crowd up. And sure enough, like Zion had a big run to bring, you know, Duke up to take the lead. And then I think there was some extracurriculars. St. John's was pushing Zion, which I don't know who in their right mind would do that to try to get him fired up. And Coach K just ripped his jacket off, and the crowd went nuts. And, you know, after that game, to kind of see him talk about, one glowing about Zion because, man, he loved him more than any player I've ever seen, especially for a freshman. But then kind of just to talk about, his team of young freshmen in a game where they really matured and, they stepped up more than anything. And I don't know, getting a chance to cover the team for 3 years, it was great to see, over the course of a season, how he views the team, how the team matures. Coach K is very unique in the way he represents his team, I'd say.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. And, what was it kind of like your freshman year, that being the Zion RJ year? I feel like it's a unique experience that not a lot of people have come through the Chronicle, not a lot of Duke students have had. Can you talk about that overall experience that year?
Yeah, I mean, there was just from the comparison of being a student there, it's your freshman year, it's your first year on campus, these guys are superstars on campus. But then, it's really my first experience covering the team. And the hype was wild. There's just no comparison to the amount of media on campus. Every game was prime time. And it was like a professional team. And I would just Coach K, going back to the thing that makes Coach K unique is that obviously Duke is Duke. Pressure is always on Duke. And Coach K just finds a way to shoulder everything for his guys. You ask a lot of people around the country, Coach K is probably, even though he's arguably the greatest coach of all time, he's obviously one of the most hated because people don't like Duke, obviously. And he just takes it in stride in his own way and diverts the attention away from his own team so that his young guys, these one and dones can excel and focus on themselves. And even though, I'm sure the fame was still there for Zion, Cam, and Trey and RJ, obviously it was, he did a big part in, he had a big role in sheltering from them and keeping, the team's mind focused, just away from all the hoopla,
Last and certainly not least, we have current sports editor Jake Piazza. Jake talks about his initial reactions to Coach K's retirement and his favorite moments from this season so far.
For me, I will never forget the moment that my phone lights up with a text from another person I'm sure you've heard on this podcast from Shane Smith. He had texted me over the initial tweet from Jeff Goodman about Coach K set to retire. And I remember just being shocked. And I think it was really because I'm the same grade as Michael Savarino, Coach K's grandson. So I think it was always kind of the underlying writing was we all expected Coach K to retire the same year that Michael was planned to graduate. And so for the news to drop what felt like 1 year early was truly just shocking to me. And I would say that next 24 hours was a total whirlwind, unlike anything I had ever experienced before in terms of covering that entire day. But my favorite part of being a small piece of that entire process was the following day, getting to go to Coach K's retirement press conference in Durham. And I remember walking in with Shane into Cameron, and it is just a surreal feeling coming through those doors and knowing everything that Coach K had built in the 40 years at Duke. And the question I'd actually had asked him was, I'm paraphrasing it a bit here because I don't remember it word for word, but it was just, it's really hard to do anything for 40 years, let alone do it well. How have you done that? And that's the thing that kept coming back to me throughout the process is the longevity of it all. I know that's been talked about, but I think that's what rings the most true for me is the fact that every single year he was able to do it. And he's had to change a lot. College basketball now does not look how it did 40 years ago. It doesn't look how it did 10 years ago. Heck, maybe even 5 years ago with NIL. And yet he's continued to adapt, and with the best of them too. It's not like this is a middle of the road program. This is one of the best in the country. So just sitting in that room and being surrounded by a guy who's been able to do something that long was truly a special experience that I'm never going to forget for the rest of my life.
Once the season got started, obviously there were a few just marquee games on the non-conference slate. We're recording this, December 27th, so pretty late in the year. The season's obviously still going on, but of the first few games, which one has stood out? What have been your favorite moments covering the team so far during his last season?
I mean, the one with you, Max, in Madison Square Garden against Kentucky, that game, that atmosphere, the crowd was buzzing, everything was perfect about that entire night. I mean, they showed the Coach K, I don't want to, not like a tribute video, but the kind of the recap of all that he's accomplished before the game. And being in Madison Square Garden, getting to cover Duke, Kentucky, Coach K versus Calipari, every storyline that you could possibly think of in maybe the most famous arena in the entire world, had to have been my favorite experience. Oh, and then not to mention, it was an incredible basketball game that was the game where we really got to see Trevor Keels break out. Paulo Banchero had a phenomenal game. Wendell played great too, but I think it was it 2 games later when he posted that triple-double and really said his hello, I'm Wendell Moore, junior season Wendell Moore, nice to meet you. And then I again, being in that press conference too, there's that aura in the room of this is going to be Coach K's last game he's coached in Madison Square Garden, somewhere he's coached at tons and tons of games. And again, getting to be there in such a, I guess, historic atmosphere, really, with all he's done, and getting to sit in that room is, again, a very special experience that I'll never forget.
Have you noticed anything that's different about him during this season? It seems like, I think you made a comment to me after the game or after the press conference that time, that he kind of seems to be smelling the roses a little bit. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I do remember that, Max, with the post-game press conference at Madison Square Garden, when in most of the press conferences, it had always been about just the next game and this season, and with Coach K, that's expected, right? That there's a reason he's been able to do it for 40 plus years. But I felt like maybe there was that brief second of smelling the roses in Madison Square Garden. So that was just, a heartwarming sports moment to see and be in the room about, because it's more than deserved. And I mean, awesome to see that little brief pause where he can look back at the great career that he's had.
So that's everyone. Hope you enjoyed this compilation as much as I enjoyed putting it together. It really was a joy to talk with so many people who have covered the program and covered Coach K over the years. It was awesome. Felt like each of their individual perspectives would help put Coach K's career in a better context, and figured that some different voices on this podcast would be a welcome change. Can't thank Charlie, John, Ben, Andrew, Amrith, Hank, Mitchell, Michael, Winston, Derek, Connor, Evan, Shane, and Jake enough. Thanks, guys. So with that, our little holiday compilation comes to an end. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and be sure to check out DukeChronicle.com and at Duke Basketball on Twitter for all of our content as ACC play rolls on. Thanks everyone.